Hey y'all, I'm Morgan White, and today I'll be giving my presentation over Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman was born on May 31st, 1819 in Long Island, New York. Whitman was one of 8 children to Walter Whitman Sr. and Louisa Whitman. During his early years, the Whitmans constantly moved houses. His father tried to buy homes and fix them up for profit to sell. Unfortunately, he didn't really succeed in that very much. Whitman attended a public school in Brooklyn and was not a very notable student. He did not appreciate the strictness of the institution nor the corporal punishment for the offenses. Years later, as a journalist, he would campaign for the end of such barbaric treatment of children. Largely, Walt Whitman was a man who, even as a child, would be noted for his preference for the idleness. Many friends, relatives, and bosses, and even acquaintances would note on Whitman's penchant for idleness. Ironic, considering Whitman was a writer who produced thousands of pages of writings, including journalism, letters, poems, nonfiction, short stories, and even novels. Whitman's formal education ended at the age of 11. He would go on to work as an office boy and a printer. He was a school teacher from 1836 to 1841, even teaching his younger brother George at one point. Many of his students remembered him as a good schoolmaster. However, others complained that he was half-hearted towards his work, and that he tended to put more focus and energy on his writing, which led him to having 8 teaching appointments in the 6 years he worked in the profession. In the 1840s, he proceeded to be hired and then fired from several newspapers. By 1845, he had worked at 10 different newspapers. In 1848, he moved to New Orleans to work on the New Orleans Crescent, and he took his youngest sibling, Jeff, with him. This turned out to be a very short-lived position. Jeff was homesick, and Whitman's career as a journalist was held back in the area, largely to him being a Northerner and political tensions of the time. Walt and Jeff Whitman returned to New York after only 4 months in New Orleans. In 1855, Whitman published his most well-known work, Leaves of Grass. His father died less than a week later. Whitman's brother George was of the first to enlist when the Civil War broke out. Whitman worked with the military in an army paymaster's office for a time. During this, he would visit local hospitals and bring small gifts such as candy to the wounded soldiers. He also volunteered cleaning wounds and dressing them, and assisted with operations, most notably amputations. During this period, he composed a collection of Civil War poems called Drum Taps, and later on published sequel to Drum Taps. During Whitman's later years, his abilities as a poet were notably even to him on the decline. In 1865, Whitman admitted his older brother Jesse into an insane asylum, where he died in 1870. Whitman suffered from a stroke in 1873 and again in 1875. He died on March 26, 1892, at the age of 72. Whitman never married and had no children. Even so, his role towards his younger siblings was parental, and Whitman once wrote, or noted, "Though a bachelor, I have several boys and girls that I consider my own." As for Whitman's works, he had a very prolific career. Perhaps his most well-recognized work today would be The Leaves of Grass. Originally, it was a volume of 12 poems that he published at his own expense in 1855. Before his death, it went to version number 9. He added to it and changed it quite a bit. Though at the time Leaves of Grass was considered a commercial failure due to poor sale numbers, critics proclaimed it as the appearance of bold new poetry. Ralph Waldo Emerson praised Whitman for Leaves of Grass, writing to Whitman saying, "I am not blind to the worth of the wonderful gift of Leaves of Grass. I find it the most extraordinary piece of wit and wisdom that America has yet contributed." Other collections by Walt Whitman were Children of Adam, Calamus, Birds of Passage, Sea Drift, By the Roadside, Drum Taps, sequel to Drum Taps, Autumn Rivulets, Whispers of Heavenly Death, From Noon to Starry Night, Songs of Parting, Sands at 70, Goodbye My Fancy, Old Age Echoes, and 2 books he wrote were Franklin Evans and Democratic Vistas. As a writer considered to be by most to be the father of American poetry, Walt Whitman touched on a wide variety of subjects in his works. The Leaves of Grass, for example, was back then, and I suppose now still, was considered very sexual in nature. So much so that Whitman was once fired because an employer read it and found it very vulgar. In the New York Tribune in July 23, 1855, Charles A. Dana critiqued The Leaves of Grass, saying that Whitman's language is too frequently reckless and indecent, and that it was quite out of place amid the decorum of modern society. An anonymous quote that was published in the Literary Gazette on July 7, 1860, in London said, "Of all the writers we have ever pursued, Walt Whitman is the most silly, the most blasphemous, and the most disgusting." On the other hand, other literary contemporaries of Whitman's of the time, such as Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, praised The Leaves of Grass for its wit and boldness. Other notable themes that Whitman were partial to was One Great America, democracy, individualism, and industry and labor. Whitman's theme of One Great America isn't surprising, considering he lived during a time that America was expanding west. Manifest destiny was a key in the society of the day. Whitman's A Broadway Pageant is a good example of his enthusiasm towards America's expansion towards the Pacific and even beyond. I chant the world on my western sea, I chant the new empire grander than any before. As its vision comes to me, I chant America the mistress, I chant a greater supremacy. Democracy is also a major component found in Whitman's works. He opposed tyranny and discrimination, and was well aware of the faults of his society. His opposition to slavery was one of the reasons that his stay in New Orleans was so short. Individualism is also key in Whitman's works. The reason Whitman was so partial to democracy in the first place was that it allowed for the opportunity for the development of self. Whitman believed in the common American, and one theme of his is industry and labor. Industrialism in America was booming in Whitman's time. Whitman's works voiced the American thirst for renovation and change, the eagerness to drive ahead, doing and making. The rapid pace of industrial development symbolized eternal renewal and inevitable advancement to Whitman. Overall, Whitman was a very complex man. He lived in a time of great growth and change in America. His works contributed to the advancement of America's literature.